Are you all set, Richard? Thumbs
All
up.
good.
All right. I think we've got a few people. We've given people a few minutes to come in, so I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our next talk in our HDR series this week. This is the Social Change Symposium, and thanks to many of you who have already come out to our other events. It's exciting to have our first online event of the week after a very successful in-person event with nice wine and cheese. And I hope you've all got maybe a glass of wine or a cup of tea in front of you and settling in for the latest event. It is not 5 o'clock at night where our keynote speaker is. In fact, it's 6 in the morning for Professor Richard Watermeyer, who is our esteemed guest today. I would like to start first by acknowledging the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university today. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges ancestors and elders past and present. And we also acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. I would just ask that people please, I see most people, almost everyone's got their cameras off, which is wonderful practice in terms of bandwidth and making sure that everything works smoothly today. We will have time for questions at the end. You're also welcome to, of course, put some questions into the chat as we go, and I will kind of keep an eye on those as Professor Watermeyer is speaking. But I think you'll find it's a very engaging and interesting talk today. I would like to introduce you to Professor Watermeyer, who is Professor of Higher Education and co-director of the Center for Higher Education Transformations at the University of Bristol. He is by training and orientation a sociologist of higher education with expertise related to, especially to academic praxis, institutional and research governance, scientific accountability and engagement, and higher education policy reform. His recent books include Competitive Accountability in Academic Life, The Struggle for Social Impact and Public Legitimacy, The Impact Agenda, Controversies, Consequences, and Challenges, and the forthcoming handbook, which is almost finished, about academic freedom. Today, he's going to be sharing with us some stories from the trenches from a series of interviews that he's completed. Very exciting work, fresh out of the gate. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to you, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. That's terrific. And it's great to be with you today. I only wish I was there in person. Sadly, I contracted COVID a few weeks ago, and I'm negative, but I'm still coming out of it. So, but nonetheless, here we go. This has been a year in the making, and is currently work that's been written up, and it's a presentation. It's the first presentation of this work, in fact, that draws on a wide UK consultation of the higher education community, involving funders, regulators, chief scientific advisors, members of government, senior civil servants, you name it, anyone who's got anything to do with policy engagement, and policy engagement specifically by academics. And this project stems from about 15 years of work and of me exploring, first off, this new thing that emerged, new thing-ish, in about 15 years ago in UK higher education, which was a public engagement agenda, which had taken root back in the 80s from a public understanding of science movement, and has different kind of vernacular attached to it these days in terms of third mission and a variety of other kind of sub expressions like community engagement or scientific engagement or schools outreach. Anyway, after about doing 15 years of examining what does this public engagement agenda mean for higher education, but also for policy, it suddenly struck me that we were still no clearer in terms of what the actual value proposition of this thing is. So here began a study that would try and actually ascertain, well, what is this value proposition? What do we actually mean when we're talking about public engagement in terms of how we're valuing it, how it's being motivated within institutional contexts, and moreover, what the impact of it is. So this is very much the course of the conversation that I'm going to have with you, my time this morning, your time this evening, in terms of what's the contribution and cost of of engagement. And I'm going to be looking at a very specific form of engagement, and one which I'm going to claim has actually eclipsed a standard notion of public engagement undertaken in universities in the UK, and that is policy engagement. And how our academic communities are more frequently drawn towards an interface with a policy-making community, on the basis that through the provision of evidence, through the academic research which they mine, this leads to better policy outcomes and therefore better societal outcomes, public benefits, etc., etc. Okay, can I move us on to the next slide, please? There's quite a lot to cover. So yeah, so here we are, top right-hand corner. Here we are. This is me, University of Bristol in the UK. We're a leading Russell Group institution. And this is the seat from which I was trying to begin to understand, right in the bottom hand right corner, an initial understanding of, well, what is this, the value proposition of public engagement? And that began with a number of interviews with key kind of public engagement authorities in the UK. Ranging from directors of public engagement support organisations to some of the major government-sponsored organisations that are involved in terms of public engagement for policy purposes. What was interesting is what became very apparent after about 10 interviews was this sense that public engagement was on the wane when we were thinking of it as undertaken from universities and by academic constituencies. And actually what was coming much more to the forefront was this policy engagement. And specifically here, when I talk about policy engagement, what I'm really talking about is the way with which academics based in UK universities are interfacing with a UK centralised government in Westminster and Whitehall. And the two branches here really, so we're talking about an interface with government, UK government, but also UK Parliament. Okay, and of course I have to mention that this is a British Academy funded project. Next slide, please. Okay, so before I get into all the nitty-gritty, and actually we can just run through all yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, if we can just run through all of those. So what I wanted to do was to start with by saying, okay, well, if we're talking about public engagement, if we're talking about policy engagement by academics, what's the context in which this sits? What is the current state of UK higher education? And I'm sure there's a lot here that's going to be very familiar to you in an Australian context. So let's run through some of these. So the first is this notion of an increasing influence on technologies of governance. And in the UK, the big one that we have is the Research Excellence Framework. When we think about research, we've had the Teaching Excellence Framework. We also have a thing called the Knowledge Exchange Framework. So these are all tools and technologies of governance that are being used to make sure that academics are fulfilling their societal obligations in terms of producing the best research, the best kinds of teaching, and the best kinds of knowledge with the widest forms of impact. And all of this ties up with this notion of an increasingly metricized academy where everything is measured according to new public management technologies and these different kinds of technologies of governance. We have a system that's dominated by what I call competitive accountability. And in other words, a sense that everything in academic life has moved from a position of performing public accountability to accountability as a tool for the generation of positional goods like prestige, funding, and other sorts of income. And the sense that if we follow the work of people like Paul Blackmore, that we inhabit this environment that is governed, is directed by prestige economics. Nothing particularly new there, but in a way, with the increasing competitive nature of higher education, certainly in a globalized higher education context, we see the role of prestige playing an even greater part in terms of the day-to-day of academic life. At the same time, we find in the UK, especially, the onslaught and increase and escalation in terms of staff precarization and casualization, so labour forms of casualization and precarious conditions, which in here we are just about to launch into yet another further strand of industrial action. We have strike action, which actually commences tomorrow and Friday and runs through again on Monday. Which is a response to falling work conditions, deteriorating work conditions in UK universities, issues around salary, pensions, and the like. We also find, as is true in most elite higher education context, a hyper-competitive labour market, super amounts of competition for too few jobs. We have, regrettably, huge amounts of structural inequality within our institutions that can be based around things such as social class, gender, race, ethnicity. Gender is obviously is always one that's quite easy to point with in terms of the way with which we have disproportionate representation, inadequacies in terms of career pathways, career and remuneration-based ceilings, and certainly in terms of unequal burden undertaken by female academic staff. And there's a huge literature on that, which I don't have time to go into now. We've also had for some time in the UK a mental health crisis, both affecting students and faculty, and that this has been exacerbated by what I've called recently with work with colleagues into the impacts of institutional response to the pandemic. We've called it pandemia. And this experience of academic life during the global COVID-19 pandemic in terms of increased labour and specifically rapid work intensification caused by a migration to online forms and remote forms of working. And we've seen a prolonged move now. We're seeing a reorganisation of work in universities, which is in many respects at one part liberating, and there's all sorts of affordances. But also, as we've previously talked of, my team, we've talked about many of the afflictions of this new form of working and work intensification, where we have the blurring of boundaries between private and professional worlds. A major part of the pandemic and this condition of pandemia has also been a breakdown of trust in leadership. And this in part has been viewed as a consequence of a prolonged shift to a crisis management mode of operations within university, which shows no sign of abating, and what some have spoken of as a kind of transition to gold command and non-democratic, non-consultative forms of governance within universities. And this is especially prevalent within the current union campaigning for better qualities of work. And a lot of actual demonizing of senior university leaders who receive significant and what some perceive to be excessive forms of remuneration, whereas we've seen a basic overall fall of cost, a fall in terms of real work salaries affected by a crisis of living context in the UK. We also see much of a problem in terms of a toxic management culture, and this is driving what some have referred to as academia's great resignation. We've just finished doing some work on this actually, and see that academia, much like other key sectors, is also impacted by this an impoverished managerial culture within universities, which is causing something of an exodus, and many academic staff to say, we've had enough, we're out. I've already mentioned the fact that we've got this backdrop of ongoing industrial action, which follows years. Actually, we've been doing this for quite a long time now in terms of academics fighting back against pay, pensions, and reductions and working conditions. Also, really importantly, is a backdrop of the current government, a populist government, a relatively right-wing government that we've had now for over a decade in the UK, which I think is fair to say is quite hostile to the work of universities. So we have a hostile policy environment for higher education, which itself is really problematic, particularly as it drives a lot of those kind of metricized behaviors, a lot of the kind of competitive accountability within universities, which exacerbates many of the forms of inequalities and complaints that many faculty have in terms of deteriorating work conditions and the like. We've also found, not only as a result of many of these horrific things that I'm talking about, workforce attrition caused by a lot of these things, but we've also found, because of things like Brexit, which of course has been a massive geopolitical repositioning of the UK and the UK academy, we've seen academics take flight, and a diaspora of UK academics or academics that have been based in UK universities to other international settings. So I guess overall we've got the sense that the system is broken, and we've got a clear sense of academia's fading allure. But thrown into the mix of all this stuff is the fact that academics, especially through the lens of work intensification, are probably doing more now than they've ever done before, especially in formalised and performance-based forms of work. So, you know, the extent to which these technologies of governance wield authority over what we do, where we have these cultures of audit, of cultures of surveillance, academics are continuously expected to perform across a variety of different metrics. One of them, of course, being public engagement, or rather public engagement. And again, I refer to this notion of competitive accountability. We practice public engagement as a means with which to demonstrate and articulate our public accountability. We are, after all, in the UK, the vast majority of academics are funded by the public purse. This is our duty. This is our ethical, moral obligation to show back what is our return on investment on that made by the public. Okay, next slide, please. So let's think about public engagement as a formalized component of academic work, especially over the period of the last 15 years, where we've seen in UK universities a lot of its institutionalization. So we've had a series of significant funding initiatives that have gone into this, which have asked academics to begin to experiment more and develop new forms of methodologies in terms of thinking about how they interact with their external communities. This is all about an attempt to break down the ivory tower. How do we do, dare I say it, and to get into this word, the impact, and show the impact of our research in terms of its economic and societal benefits. We've done 15 years of this, and people are still kind of scratching their heads in terms of when that question is asked, well, what actually is the point of this? What is the value of it? Yes, we can claim a kind of normative moral declaration that this is a good thing to do, but beyond that, what have we got? Is the evidence a bit thin? So these were some of the questions that I was really trying to test out by engaging with and across the UK higher education community in terms of what is this point of public engagement. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first thing to say is public engagement is problematized because in a lot of people's mind, it's kind of soft impact. And what came through loud and clear through many of the interviews I've done, and bearing in mind just to re-emphasize and reiterate the voices that I'm presenting to you here, and there's going to be a ton of different kind of interview excerpts, are those from a higher education community, including funders, including regulators, including directors of public engagement within universities, directors of policy institutes within universities, chief scientific advisors, heads of organizations and learned societies, royal academies and the like. So the who's who've got a sense of what is this engagement beast and what does it mean for academics. So we begin straight off the bat with people saying, well, hang on a minute, public engagement is an inherently good thing. Yeah, we can point to normative moral declarations of why this is a good thing to do. But in this metricized landscape that we have, where we have these technologies of governance, performance-based research, funding systems like the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, the problem is we need to show and demonstrate hard impacts. And the problem with public engagement is it's kind of soft. It's not hard enough. It's all soft. It's sort of, and we get this a lot, the sense of it's nice and fluffy, but very difficult to pin down in any kind of solid, tangible terms, especially economic terms, that really can make the point of its value. So we get, and I've done a ton of research in this area specifically in terms of how public engagement professionals are valued within universities, the struggle they have in terms of boundary crossing, where they have low status typically within institutions, and how they confront this prestige economics of higher education. So we've got public engagement right at the offset, right off the bat, as suffering from an issue of soft impact and therefore low status within an intensively stratified and hierarchical system of HE. Okay, next slide. Okay, what we've also got, and this comes through especially strongly from the professional public engagement community, so public engagement professionals working within universities, directors of public engagement institutes, and those not only within universities, but those operating also directly at the interface between science and public policy. So what we've got is this sense of, well, we haven't ever been really clear as a public engagement community about what the success of public engagement is, what it looks like. We've been too immersed in a kind of conversation and a discourse around values, and probably haven't been quite instrumental enough in terms of saying, well, instrumentally, here's the real impact, here's the solid, hard truth of what we produce by undertaking this activity. So we have this sense that we've got a lack of consensus in terms of its value proposition, but we've also crucially got a dearth of cogency, of real compelling accounts of what the value of this activity is. Next slide, please. What we've also seen, and I worked with my great colleague Jean Rowe on this, who's also written tons on the whole public engagement agenda broadly for higher education and science-based organizations, is this sense that whilst we've had 15 years of significant funding and mobilization of academics in terms of doing this, we're now seeing something in terms of a bit of an atrophy of public engagement within universities. So whilst there's been a huge amount of emphasis on culture change, getting academics engaged, breaking down and dismantling the ivory tower, actually what we tend to see is a retreat of public engagement. And in simple terms, this means the erosion of public engagement professional staff within universities, the collapsing of units, a lot of talk about public engagement, but not a huge amount of action. And increasingly, it's undertaking being done by these public engagement professionals and less by academics. And primarily, this is because it features less, excuse me, less integrated into institutional cultures. It's less integrated into research. And some of the worrying things we've also seen from a UK perspective has been the hollowing out in terms of an explicit focus on public engagement by major funders, for instance, such as the Wellcome Trust in the UK, that was really at the forefront of the embedding and the institutionalization of public engagement as a core component of what academics do. Their whole public engagement unit disappeared, their focus on public engagement gone. So even from a funder's perspective, there's real question marks in terms of where public engagement is and concerns that we're seeing the continued atrophy of it. Next slide, please. So we have got the sense public engagement's in the doldrums. And while universities will bang on about their civic mission and their reflections on how their local community organizations and all the rest of it, actually what we tend to see when we look across the UK university sector is we see it's under-resourcing and it being typically underappreciated, having a problem of status and low value status, at least in universities. And a lot of this ties into what I've previously written about in terms of an impact agenda in UK higher education, which was formalized in the Research Excellence Framework in 2014. And impact being a measure of our research excellence. But crucially, how do we demonstrate the impact of our research, the societal, the economic impact of our research? And of course, most people say, well, you do that through engagement. But public engagement itself, crucially, within the Research Excellence Framework itself, does not constitute impact. It's conceptualized as a conduit to impact, but not a form of impact in and of itself. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that now in the next slide, please. Okay, yeah, and a lot of this is about the extent to which a public engagement infrastructure in UK universities seems to have essentially eroded. We've also got a community of professionals there who are they're fed up. They feel that they're stuck in a rut, that they're underappreciated, they're not particularly well recognized. There's also quite interestingly, and I've written a book chapter on this recently, which talks about a gendered problem. So the vast majority of those engaged in public engagement work, both within professional service staff levels within universities, but also academics. There's a real female gendered bias here, which is something I picked up when we did a pan-UK survey of the state of art of public engagement within universities, that it's mainly picked up by, and the burden carriers, as typically can be the case with a lot of this stuff, by female academics. So there is this kind of genderized problem about public engagement revealing many of the kind of structural gender-based inequalities within universities, but its genderization also affecting its overall sense of impact and value within institutions. So we've even got the public engagement community there stuck in a rut, and part of that is also, I think, and it was interesting, I got through the interviews a clear sense from many of the major public engagement players that there's been a failure to innovate, there's been a failure to reimagine or move this public engagement agenda along. Next slide, please. Some, interestingly, say that actually we need to stop talking about public engagement. Instead, we need to move the conversation on. And if we've got to a point of impasse, of atrophy of public engagement in the universities, let's think instead about, and engaged research is obviously talked about a lot, but engaged research within a paradigm of co-production. So we need, as this individual said here, we need to move this higher education along to think more about engagement as a form of knowledge production. And dare I say it, there's that word, knowledge co-production, which is obviously heavily contested, and I'll show how it's contested, certainly from the perspective of a policy community as well later on. But thinking about the role of public engagement as something now that is evolved towards a point of thinking about, well, how do we do co-produced knowledge? How do we get experts working with non-experts in a way where we're having enriched and better knowledge, not just in the typical kind of dissemination or unidirectional flow of knowledge, which a lot of public engagement, despite so much talk around upstream engagement and breaking a deficit model of public engagement, hasn't ever really seemed to surpass. Next slide, please. Okay, so whilst public engagement professionals and the infrastructure is seen to be breaking down, collapsing somewhat in UK universities, the other thing that's really interesting is when we look at it in the formalized context of something like the Research Excellence Framework, where much of the public engagement, certainly when it came to 2014, and we had this first installment of impact, it's worth saying that impact within the REF constitutes about 20% of the overall value of the exercise. That was in 2014, where you'd also have research, so evaluation of outputs, and environment, evaluation of the overall environment within which it sits. So what we found within 2014 was clearly a lot of people said, well, surely public engagement counts. As was then, the rules were, as is now, public engagement itself doesn't count as a form of impact in and of itself, but it's a route to impact. What we see when we compare, so we've obviously recently in the UK just had our latest installment of the REF, slightly delayed because of the pandemic, but we see an overall downturn in terms of public engagement. In fact, a massive downturn in the way with which public engagement features in impact case studies. So impact case studies, for those who don't know, are narrative accounts of the impact of research that are submitted by academics to particular units of assessment, so be that education, sociology, whatever, that describes the impact of their research. Now, back in 2014, we found that about 73% of all impact case studies directly mention public engagement. So we get this clear sense that public engagement is being conceptualized as a form of impact, even though officially it can't constitute impact. It's nevertheless there as explicitly within these impact case studies. When we move forward to 2021 and the next iteration of this impact exercise and evaluation, we see that public engagement has dropped massively from 73% down to 33% mention in terms of the public engagement, in terms of mention of public engagement within impact case studies. So massive fall off. At the same time, what we do see separating 2014 and 2021 is an increase in terms of the number of case studies that are directly mentioning policy. So not a huge amount, but overall 7% increase, which of course is actually larger because there were fewer impact case studies submitted. So there were 6,361 impact case studies submitted by UK universities for evaluation as part of REF 2021. So about 300 less than in 2014. So what's the measures? Overall, we've got the sense that public engagement is lowering in terms of its exposure. We've got policy engagement on the up. We've also got this kind of sense, that, you know, well, are we moving towards policy engagement because it's high prestige and because the public engagement is just mired within this as a low prestige, low status activity? Yeah, we probably are. Next slide, please. So why are we doing it? If we are seeing more policy engagement, well, why are we doing more policy engagement? Is the rationalization bifurcated in terms of a public or a positional motivation? Well, I think in large part when we see tools and these technologies of research governance like the REF, you know, and the sense of a culture of competitive accountability within universities, actually what we're tending to see is this is more driven by and incentivized by the acquisition of positional goods, greater influence, an ability to be greater purveyors of competitive accountability, bringing in the highly evaluated impact case studies, which of course bring into UK universities significant amounts of public funding. The Research Excellence Framework, of course, is the means by which the UK Treasury distributes about £2 billion every year of research funds across universities based upon the quality of the research and of course, as part of that quality, the impact of their research. So we're seeing a lot of policy engagement, and this came through continuously within all the interviews, that so much of policy engagement, yeah, part of it is driven by people that just want to be able to impact policy, but an awful lot of it is about the acquisition of influence and the celebritization of academics, these academic superstars. So I've written about this with people like Jen Chubb, about the creation of this culture of academics impact superstars. Okay, next slide, please. Excuse me. So a lot of this is about, if we're doing policy engagement, a lot of this is about capital, right? This is capital acquisition, capital accumulation, developing political capital. And why is that important? Well, it's about developing a reputation, especially at an institutional level, where we've seen in the UK widening in terms of or evolving in terms of the different kinds of ways in which we can secure research funding, especially, and more academics understanding, because we've obviously had 12 years and we're going through second phase now of austerity in the distribution of public funds, and there's other ways with which to generate money. One of those ways, of course, is through direct to government commissions and consultation type work. So this is also about raising the profile, the reputation of an institution in terms of saying, hey, well, we can do some of this work, and becoming even more competitive within the already ultra competitive research funding landscape. And then there's some really interesting stuff here. You know, this is about setting universities up and institutions to be more competitive in terms of attracting different sorts of research funds. But this is also about a kind of schmoozy culture, and there was a real sense here of senior people schmoozing with important government officials, rather amusingly. Next slide, please. So what we get a lot through, and there's 4 points here, if we can just run these down. So if we're talking about policy engagement, yes, a lot of it is incentivized by the ref, but is it really helping us to do better forms of policy engagement? If the sense that policy engagement might be rationalized as using evidence mined from academic research to produce better forms of policy, are we achieving that? Well, a lot of the suggestion from this and from other work that I've done is no, it's not. It's not actually enabling policy engagement. It might be incentivizing it, but it's not necessarily enabling it in terms of the desired impacts and outcomes we might expect of it. So we get instead a real sense of fatigue and frustration that's coming through from government in terms of being constantly asked, where they've had an interaction with a researcher, to then provide a testimonial saying how wonderful the impact of that research has been. We've also got this sense of that academics are still engaged in this kind of sense of, well, I'm going to throw out my research into the ether and take less of a kind of strategic approach in terms of getting the impact of the research mobilized. So a lot of this is conceived of as in terms of just getting the evidence out onto the right desks and right departments on the basis that you think that's going to get somewhere. Of course, the reality is the policy making process is incredibly complex, it's incredibly opaque, it's entirely non-linear, and it demands significant amounts of strategy in terms of getting research heard, which of course in and of itself isn't a guarantee that any form of impact might emerge from it. Next slide, please. And there's a variety of just of accounts there. Another interesting thing that really comes through strongly is when we're talking about policy engagement, are we actually talking about the generation of real impact? Now, back in 2014, or just after 2014, I interviewed a ton of parliamentarians working within the UK Parliament, parliamentary select committee clerks, parliamentary researchers, a whole bunch of them, to try and ascertain, is there such a thing as academics making an impact on Parliament? And the vast majority of them said, no, you can't. You can't do it because the machinery of Parliament itself and the machinery of the wider government policy community is just too dense, it's too convoluted. There's too many working and spinning parts here. Academics' interaction with the policy community is ultimately so slight, and it's just one part of the mechanism. More to the point, if there is to be impact gained through the use of academic evidence, then you know what, most of the time policymakers are going to claim it for themselves. So there's a real sense that actually in the terms of doing impact, is it impact or is it just more engagement? Maybe it's just more about us having an engagement because the impact claims are just difficult to substantiate. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here's a problem. We're getting all tangled up here. We're just assuming, and a large part of the problem is, and even though a lot of academics recognize this, there's an assumption with any kind of impact within the impact agenda, that you have these kind of clear lines of attribution, that you can easily demonstrate causality. Here's the research, here's the impact. But of course, we've got this massive entanglement of multiple moving parts, multiple stakeholders, multiple different kinds of actors within the policy making process. So the call from those within a government or parliamentary setting is, no, you know what, you can't really impact. All you can do is get your work on the desk and hope for the best. But actually the sense of being able to measure impact in the way in which a metricized academy suggests it can be, in the way in which we think competitive accountability makes the case for, and the ref certainly makes the case for, actually maybe this is a non-reality. Maybe it's just about this kind of engagement. Next slide, please. What we're also probably guilty of, whilst we overestimate the ability of academics to penetrate and impact, is this over-egging, and this is especially important. I mean, Parliament, we've got Parliament and government, of course, but the over-egging of the importance of our parliamentary interactions. And it's interesting because in the UK, so much of the investment in terms of an academic policy interfaces works at the parliamentary level. So we have parliamentary fellowships. We have an organisation called the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology that hosts PhD students and gets them in to write interesting policy briefs. So big focus in terms of policy engagement on Parliament. However, it's pretty small when you compare to the kind of policy representation within the ref. And I always turn to the ref because this ref is where so much of this is formalised. So, you know, we've got a lot of maybe an overestimation in terms of how much Parliament is being imagined by academics or being evidenced by academics in terms of their claims of impact. And I think the other thing, as this quote really points towards, is that actually we're making an assumption here that parliamentarians are all sitting there waiting to receive all this wonderful academic information that they're going to use and build recommendations around or critique policy with. But actually, that might just not be the case. Next slide, please. And it might not be the case because, as we know, and as I've written in the competitive accountability book, especially, the procedure of, for instance, presenting both written and verbal evidence to a select committee that's focused on a particular problem will be one form of evidence among many, 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 many others. And actually what tends to be seen to be the case is that academic evidence is right down the pecking order, and instead what you tend to get is industry, business, and those powerful lobbyists who produce evidence having their evidence right up the top. Notwithstanding, even if we're over-egging the importance of our interactions with Parliament, we're all fixated on it. And this is all because of the prestige economics. If people want to think about policy impact, they're not really thinking so much about their impact on local government or even on devolved government as we have in the UK in the devolved context of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. No, instead, it's all about the UK government, and it's specifically thinking about Westminster itself. And Westminster, even more than even thinking about the government departments within Whitehall. So this is more in the academic UK academic mindset. When we're thinking about policy impact, we're thinking about how we're impacting politicians, and that's where it gets really fraught. Next slide, please. Before I get to the ultimate fraughtness of this, I just want to re-emphasize that point that when we are trying to have this kind of policy engagement and where we're doing it, and the incentive for doing the policy engagement is to demonstrate some kind of impact. Of course, this is a total shot in the dark. When we submit evidence or we have those conversations with policymakers, it's a shot in the dark. And so much of it, of course, is based upon a relational interface and building relationships over a long period of time. And of course, in the political landscape, we get a disjuncture because the policy cycle moves. So, you know, we get new politicians, especially in the UK context, as has been patently manifest over the course of the last year, where we've had a number of different prime ministers, a number of different chancellors of the exchequer and such and so on. So the sense is that we don't really know what's going to happen in terms of the relationships that we might build with the policy making community and their sustainability. We just hope for the best. So a lot of this policy engagement is still a shot in the dark. Next slide, please. Okay, let's get into more of the challenges. Next slide, please. So the challenges for policy engagement. Okay, so some of this is about, do we not ourselves as academics need to climb down a little bit? You know, if we're public engagement so much about dismantling the ivory tower, do we also not need to get into the mindset that maybe actually as much as we think of and we do self-preservation through a projection of our research as the most important, as the best evidence, right? It's peer reviewed, it's methodologically rigorous, it's theoretically informed. But actually, do we overprivilege academic research? Do we overclaim its significance? Are there other forms of evidence that are just as valuable? Well, actually, the truth is, in the policy landscape, as I've already alluded to, yes, they are, and they are actually of a higher order. So there's a danger here that we're overestimating our own sense, and we're overinflating our sense of self-importance and the value of our academic research. Next slide. We've also got to remember, as I've already alluded to, that the selection and the use of evidence is quite arbitrary and incredibly selective. And we've also got, and here's a major problem, we've also got a populist government at the moment, and we've seen a trend from the previous Labour government and the new Labour government in the UK towards the current, what was the Tory Lib Dem coalition, the current Tory government. We've seen a complete drop-off in terms of an emphasis on evidence-based and evidence-informed policy. So we've now got basically a bunch of politicians who aren't particularly interested in this. And a lot of this kind of reared itself back with the Brexit debate. And infamously, we had one of our major MPs, who I think is back in as a member of cabinet, Michael Gove, who talked about we've had enough of experts, and actually expertise being a real obstacle in terms of the creation of public policy. So we've got this sense of an unsympathetic political landscape, or a political landscape that will pick and choose the evidence it wants to inform the kind of political agendas that it's focused upon delivering. Next slide, please. And let's not forget, and this comes through thick and thin when you talk to anyone in either government or a parliamentary context, is it's not just about the evidence. Okay, this ultimately, when we talk about, and the problem of policy engagement is it does not operate in a neutral space. It is inherently political. So politics is so much more than what is factually true. And we've also got a sense that politicians, we don't actually want to know anymore. So there's a question here where we might even ask, are we overemphasizing this policy engagement? Have we actually reached peak saturation? Is there a sense that we've even got politicians covering their ears, which I'm going to get to in a mo. Next slide. We've also got the sense, we've got highly politicized policy areas. So there will be points where, dependent upon the policy challenge, that it's just too hot. And government may be pursuing a specific line, regardless of what the evidence base is. And here in this quote, there's one here talking about the impact in terms of refugees and asylum policy. It's just too hot to touch, and evidence just can't creep into it. So the academic community, as much as it may be clamoring on the outside, is removed and marginalized and excluded from those kinds of policy conversations. Next slide. What we also find, and this is a massive problem in terms of policy engagement, is there is a general lack of expertise in government when it comes to research. So whilst there are researchers there present, it's a diminishing number. It's worth saying as well, the research expertise within government, whilst it's there, and whilst it's also there, probably more so even in a parliamentary context, there remains a lack of awareness and a lack of understanding, and even a lack of ability to access academic research, not only because so much of the time still, despite open access arrangements, it's become more available, and it's creeping forward from behind those paywalls. But again, it's the jargon, it's the accessibility, it's the readability, it's all those kinds of things. So we still have this problem of a kind of lack of research expertise in government. Next slide. We've also got this sense that, well, and this is the culmination of all these kinds of things, have we actually got a pretty agnostic government? Who really values academic research and the evidence that it produces? So there's a group here that begrudgingly values it. There are some that really take it on, but there is still a big group there that just does not see any value in terms of academic research. And here we get again in this second interview excerpt a sense that we've moved on from the last 20 years when we had this kind of focus on evidence-based policy making. We've moved on from that to kind of this notion of sound-based policy making. Next, please. Slide, please. And again, so making the case for policy engagement. How do we make the case for this? Next slide. So the first thing that's really interesting to say is, and one of the things I put to many of my interviewees is, well, if you go into a university context and say you haven't got a policy institute, and in the UK we've seen a massive proliferation of these policy institutes that are designed to do this kind of greater engagement between academics and policymakers. We've got a variety of different networks that are established to do this, to connect policymakers with academics. We have policy fellowships with members of the policy community coming in and sitting in, spending time with academics. So we've got a lot of this kind of infrastructure that's being invested in. But what we're still struggling with is this kind of value proposition. So it's still really difficult to make the justification to senior managers about what the value of this is, other than as it's come through time and time again. If we're talking about it in the terms of performance returns, right? Performance evaluation in the context of the REF, in terms of REF impact. Next slide. Yeah, okay, we can, and there's lots, and I've done huge amounts of work which has really tried to discredit performance-based research funding systems like the REF because of its significant toxic and corruptive influence in terms of academic research and practice, and actually thinking about the true value of academic research rather than these kind of the notions of impact. But impact is really important. And when you start talking to regulators and funders and those with a directed conversation with government that are really steering and helping to steer research and protect research and public investment spend in research, they're actually saying, well, you know what, REF impact is really important because it's our means to constantly remind government of how impactful research is, what their return on the investment is. So where we've got an especially hostile government, maybe it's a case that, you know, actually the REF is a terrible, as terrible as it might seem for many academics, it's a necessary evil. It's something that we have to do to be able to maintain our public funding. Next slide, please. Worth saying, and I'm whizzing through because I'm conscious of how little time I have left. It's really important to recognise that COVID-19 was a real threshold moment for policy engagement in the UK, as I think it pretty much was everywhere. We had in the UK, for instance, daily televised updates from our chief scientific and chief medical advisors in terms of what was going on with the virus, what we needed to do to self-protect as the public and all the rest of it. It was the first time that academic research was really in the limelight. And it was the first time here, as one of my interviewees said, government interviewees said, that was the first time that we were really actually relying on academic research. It was essential to it. And I think here in the UK, as in many other countries like Australia, so much of the political decision making was based around the science. It was science-based, science-informed. So we do see incredible reliance, and have seen over the course of the last few years, incredible reliance by government on science for policy. Next slide. But a lot of this was placed upon the most senior scientists. So we have, for instance, the SAGE committee that provided an independent SAGE committee, but the SAGE committee that was providing direct government advice. But these people were working day in, day out, every day of the week. And the sense, of course, is you're still dealing with a minority of people, a select elite group of individuals who've got that interface. Much as a lot of policy engagement has always been, it's been based upon social capital, about, and a lot of those interactions, certainly if you're talking about chairs of select committee and who they call in evidence from, it will tend to be the people that they went to college with. And a lot of the time that will be in the most elite institutions. So a major call here in terms of doing of policy engagement and opening up policy engagement, certainly in the context of crisis. And if we go towards, and if we think about protecting ourselves and insulating against the threat of further crisis and health crisis and further pandemics, there's a need here to really register with a far wider, diverse community of voices. Not only for means of maintaining an ability to provide scientific advice, but also having that scientific advice representative of the widest possible community, and not just a homogenous idea of the public. Next slide, please. Yeah, problem is we had a peak. So if COVID was the nadir of policy engagement, we seem to have been going like this ever since. So we've got this sense, and particularly in a populist context, and here's our public enemy number one. the sense that we've got expert fatigue and we've got waning sense of relevance. What's the relevance of expertise? Are we tired of experts? We're actually a bit tired of academics, and they're constantly shouting out. Now, at a kind of post-crisis mode, if we can call it that, although in every which way we seem to be still very much part of crisis modality, it's harder to see, as one person said, that how academia is relevant to some of the issues that we're dealing with head on. Next slide. Then we get into, and there's just not time to really get into this, but a crucial part of thinking of the challenges of doing policy engagement is, well, how are we presenting ourselves? Are we, as Roger Pielke has done this brilliant brilliant book where he talks about the different ways in which we can think about how we do policy engagement? Are we honest brokers just saying, well, look, here's the evidence, this is how you might want to think about it, or are we really pursuing, are we operating as issue advocates, really using our evidence and what we know and our expertise to push particular agendas? Now, when you look at this in the kind of highest echelons of any kind of policy engagement, and this is specifically, and this was a chief scientific advisor, this becomes really difficult because you've got to play the political game. You cannot go in expecting, and it's this expectation of the value of the academic evidence and other forms of evidence being treated and not being recognised and not being run with by government. So a sense here is a great thing. To remain credible, to remain trustworthy as a scientist requires an ability to play the political game. Next slide, please. We're getting to the end here, folks. Yeah, so trust. The problem with a lot of public policy engagement, of course, is that it comes down to a lot of the usual suspects. I've already mentioned that kind of social capital, having the right kind of networks in place. The vast majority of those that do engage with government and with the parliamentary machine tend to be the most senior academics. They also tend to be and are typically characterized as an elderly white male brigade. Which is obviously directly in conflict with a lot of the needs in terms of saying, well, we need a greater diversity and more representative voice going on here. The problem is this is seemingly going to be a continuing uphill struggle for academics because the dominant voice is those kinds of people. And the trouble is government likes that cohort of people. So when we're talking about trusted academics, it's those who also are like the chief scientific advisor of the previous slide said, those who are of a particular esteem, have achieved a political kind of state, have achieved a certain kind of status, but are also those who have been able to build a relationship where they are able to provide flexible, malleable forms of evidence provision to government. Next slide. Yeah, and whilst we've seen this kind of classic slide here, I love this picture. Whilst we've seen a move in terms of a move away from evidence-informed policy making, we've also had clearly a real issue in terms of fake news, post-truth, as McIntyre would talk of it, and the extent to which government can be trusted. So there's also a big pushback from a lot of academics in the UK as well, who are saying, well, actually, I don't want anything to do with this. I don't want to engage because of the politics that are involved and the politics of this particular government being in complete odds with my own personal politics. And we see essentially a kind of split here between, I mean, this is a kind of crude representation, but a kind of more right wing kind of government and a right wing kind of populist politics in the UK and a left leaning academy, and there being a complete disjuncture between the two. So therefore, at what stage are we as academics, despite the pressures of all these kind of performance evaluation and performance management systems like the REF, to what extent are we actually going to be willing to have this engagement with politicians, especially where it's a case that our evidence may just be cherry picked and appropriated in ways that are just anathema to what we as critical, dispassionate, objective scientists seek to do. Next slide, please. I am coming towards the end, but there's a problem here. We've got the pressure to perform. We've got the pressure to deliver on our impact claims and the like. So we've got this trade-off between, well, do we get the policy impact? Do we get the influence? Do we get the prestige of hanging out with parliamentary staff and the like? But if we're doing that, are we ceding our critical autonomy? Are we ceding our independence? So what is the trade-off here? And is it a trade-off that all of us are going to be willing to do? does this then group us off into different types of academics? And therefore, what becomes even more problematic about the impact superstar? Next slide, please. We're almost there, folks. Yeah, more of the same in terms of is there a real problem here in terms of co-option? Are we seeing the neutralization of academics as critical agents? You know, are we just feeding evidence in particular ways? Are we undertaking research that may be impactful, or are we engineering research in a way that will be impactful? And to what extent is this harmful? To what extent do we want to maintain our trusted status with policymakers, with government, and to what extent does this jeopardize our truth, dare I say it, as academic researchers? How much are we therefore leashed by this whole agenda? Next slide. Yeah, and then there are those that in government say, well, look, just forget working with politicians, okay? Just deal directly with government departments. Those are where you want deal directly with civil servants. But of course, there's less prestige, there's less glamour, and there's less ability to craft those stories of the impact, where actually what you really want is the testimonial of a member of a select committee or a chair of a select committee, or to be able to say, well, my research was directly attributed to in policy discussion within the House of Commons or the House of Lords, etc. So we might want to dodge the politics, but they're an inherent and an undodgeable part of the policy engagement relationship. Next slide. Yeah, we started off right at the beginning by talking about when I was talking about public engagement, and actually maybe we've forgotten public engagement. Maybe we need to evolve to co-production, thinking about new forms of knowledge production. The problem is that at the moment it just feels like we're just going through the motions, that there is no real reciprocal benefit from doing that. So we're kind of superficially invested in this sense of knowledge co-production, but are we actually ever really achieving it? And there's a real sense that policy engagement or any kind of engagement doesn't really fulfill on that aspiration of doing co-produced research. Next slide. Who needs whose most? And this is a question I've asked to both sides of the camp. Is it academics that need policymakers and the policy community needs so they can show, look, here's the impact of what I'm doing? Or is it the case that the policy community really needs academics? The real sense here is we're probably at the peak point here. There is so much evidence, there is so much information that is constantly being thrown at the policy community. And of course they do, albeit depleted, they do have that in-source, in-house resourcing. So if we look at the tip of balance in terms of who needs most, it's probably going to be the academics that far outweigh their need in terms of that interaction than the policy community itself. Next slide. Okay, we're getting to the final two bits here. What if we stripped all this out? What if all the policy engagement infrastructure within universities, which is compared to the public engagement, so where we've seen the stripping out of the public engagement infrastructure, we've seen quite a lot of investment in policy engagement infrastructure. What if all that all disappeared? What if there were no policy-based fellowships? What if there was no Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology? What if all the policy institutes that seem to be springing up around universities, what if they were just to disappear? What would that mean? A lot of people seem to think that actually the immediate sense, if there was a kind of disinvestment in policy engagement, probably wouldn't notice that much. There probably wouldn't be that amount of difference. It would still be the standard people, the go-to people that would continue doing this. It would still be those white, male, elderly academics that would be mainly engaged. The problem with this is if we're really pushing towards this kind of greater diversity of voices and the diversity of academic evidence in terms of its conversation with policy, then that's going to go. And there's already a problem in terms of recruitment of young, early career and mid-career academics in having their say in the UK and engaging with the policy community. If we strip out the infrastructure, if we strip out and we move away and we reverse the kind of institutionalization of public policy engagement, then the chances are that fewer people will be engaging directly with policy. And then that raises all sorts of questions in terms of what that means both for policy and research. Others, however, when I put this question to them, have kind of said, well, maybe this is an opportunity to kind of completely overhaul our kind of conceptualization of how we do our public duty, how we do academics do the social contract. maybe this is an opportunity to get rid of things like ref impact and the ref and these other forms of technology that are guiding, are mobilizing, and are constraining so much of how we do our external interactions. Final slide. I think it's the final slide. Yeah. And then this ends up, like so much of the stuff does, with heroic individuals. Are we always just talking about, in this highly metricized, the competitive accountability, stratified academy, the prestige economics of it all? Are we always or only ever really just talking about the superstars here? Are we talking about the individual, heroic individuals, those who've already got the social capital? So what is the future of all of this kind of stuff if we don't have the support mechanisms in place to allow a flourishing of this? Is it alternatively going to be the case that where we're seeing public engagement potentially atrophy and policy engagement develop, are we in 15 years going to be looking back on this and seeing the same kind of thing? Do we really need to face the fact that we need a far greater overhaul and transformation of the higher education system in terms of how it rewards, mobilizes, incentivizes, recognizes the value of its public contribution? And I'm so sorry, I know I've massively run over. I end there.
Thank you so much, Richard. Oh, I'm hearing an echo. Maybe my team in behind the scenes can fix that. Yep, sounds like it's fixed. That was just a fantastic talk. We're just pulling your slides down so we can see your smiling face, I think. I'm just trying to see what's happening in the background. Is your camera on, Richard? I think we seem to have lost you.
Can you hear me?
Down the slides? Yeah, I can hear you.
I seem to be on screen.
I think others are telling me that they can see you, so maybe it's just me. All right, I'll just pretend that I can see you. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm sure some people will have to drop off because it's just gone past 6 and they've probably got dinner on the stove and such, but we will take a bit of time for some questions if you're happy to stay on. I know that you're probably just starting your day because it's now 7 a.m. Just on that last point, because I will open up for questions if people want to put their hands up in their space, and we can take a couple of questions. As you were speaking, I was also just thinking, I love that notion of the heroic folks, right? But there are so many also what I'd call quiet heroes, the people who actually have been doing this impact work for decades, often with very little support. Often, they didn't get workload, but they were working with community, they were bringing about real change, and nothing's going to stop them from doing that. How do we actually support those folks in this crazy politicized, machine around impact these days?
Yeah, I mean, it's the question, Lisa, and it was really interesting. I wrote a piece on this with my colleague Mike Tomlinson. And we talked about how so much of the people that are really, the applied researchers who you've just described, who've historically done this, not for personal, professional gain, but do it because it's part of their academic DNA, right? They're genetically hardwired into doing this kind of stuff. And how they kind of run into conflict with the kind of ways with which impact work of this kind is valorized, made sense of, rewarded. And there's a real complete disjuncture there. And we talked about, this kind of sense of being haunted. We talked of the impact phantom that's out there, that's haunting people and kind of disenabling them from continuing a kind of more authentic, purer sense of doing this kind of public works and realizing their civic duty. And the problem with, I think, some of that is a lot of people, I think, initially kind of thought, a lot of applied researchers thought, wow, when it started to get valorized with stuff like REF in 2014 and impact was being seen as they kind of thought, oh God, maybe now I'm finally going to be recognized for the stuff that I'm doing.
Yep.
Actually, what we found was a sense that actually it made the situation for many of them worse because they felt then exploited. They became pawns of their institutions to service, a particular kind of performance target. And there was no real sense of recognition of reward of what they were doing. and there's a lot of talk in terms of institutional amnesia, that, you know, academics have put out their impact is farmed, then it's put forward, and then they, you know, it gets evaluated, and then the university gets the spoils of that, and academics tend to be forgotten. I think there's still a real problem there, because it's still the status games, and a lot of applied researchers still aren't necessarily seen, if you're not, you know, as lower status, despite a lot of the kind of push that's driven by these kinds of regimes like the REF and the TEF and the KEF. So how do we support it? Well, I think a lot of those who've developed these kind of policy and are leading these policy institutes, for instance, would make the claim that this is where it happens, and if we don't have these kinds of institutes that are visible and crucially are visible to senior management, right, that are not actually have some investment by the university itself into them, then the chances are that we're going to miss a lot of the new generation of people that are coming through. And I think there's been a lot that's written, right, in terms of we've never had such an engaged academic community, right? I don't think there's a single academic who's not in some shape or form engaged through social media, who very much understands and recognizes that the sense of public accountability, of giving back, and the rest of it. But I think part of the problem is our struggle with the kind of systems that do the valorization of this, that formalize it, and that's the struggle. It's still this conflict with these systems that are imposed upon us, that claim to make the case of what we do, but are often seen to actually be distortions or corruptive to the sense of who we are. So I think it's the idealized versions of ourselves versus the versions of ourselves that are prescribed by different forms of performance evaluation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Stephen.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen Allones. I've been trying to have some influence during the pandemic as a social researcher, and I think the thing that we all forget most of the time is that we live in not a democracy but a liberal capitalist democracy, particularly in its neoliberal phase. And that also has expressions not only in terms of the dominant ideologies of capital, but the everyday assumptions about that magic word freedom, which we saw on the television news when various restrictions were lifted. The freedom to consume, the freedom to entertain, first world comfort, first world expectations that I can do what I like, even though this may not be true in the workplace. So our great problem in trying to have influence, and I apply this to the epidemiologist as well as myself as a social researcher, is this sort of ideological mountain of ruling values, both at the top and in everyday life, which I think we thought, you know, there's a rational policy. We would like less people to die. We would like less people to get long COVID. But people live in their own little consumer worlds or whatever. So we failed. Partly because of some of the technical reasons in terms of influence, but we failed partly because the ruling ideology really has not much place for rational policy, and the ruling politics, when the politicians decided it was not to their benefit to maintain restrictions.
Yeah. No, Stephen, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think this is so much the problem. I've talked about the prestige politics, but it's economic fundamentalism that rules the roost here and drives so much of the kind of behaviours that we have, and it inhibits, as I think I've already kind of made the case, inhibits our ability to actually engage in ways which really holds power to account. We've put this kind of straitjacket around ourselves because the ultimate aim. And this is part of self-preservation, right? I started the presentation talking about precarity, and I think we're at a point in the academy's existence where perhaps precarization of academic labour has never been more so acute. And in terms of doing the self-preservation, we have to resign ourselves from doing the real, brutal talking truth to power because it's too dangerous, it's too risky, and we've seen this in so many of the accounts that talk of the diminution of academic freedom. But this is really worrying, right? We've got new ever strengthening forms of academic complicity with systems that are actually anathema to our aspirations for what academic research should be and who we should be and how we should be confronting and acting as a custodian of knowledge and, as you said, a custodian of democracy.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I can see a number of other people are dropping off. I think we'll need to leave it there, but thank you, Richard. That was absolutely so thought-provoking. It's extremely timely. You know, here in Australia, ERA is on hold at the minute, and we're all wondering what's going to be next on the horizon for us. But so much resonates from your experience in the UK. So look forward to seeing all of this in your new book, and look forward to catching up with you again soon.
100%. And just to say, Lisa, if people have got questions that they want to field to me, please do pass on the email address, and happy to take any inquiries or questions.
We will, absolutely. And we've made a recording today, so we'll make that available as well to people. And I'm sure you're going to have a busy inbox.
Thanks ever so much.
Thanks so much. Be well. Take care.
Bye.